GPT 5.6 Soul finishes complex tasks 61% faster than Claude Fable 5, and it costs half as much per input token. $5 versus 10, and that gap changes the math on every high-volume workflow you're running right now. Both models dropped recently, and the pricing and speed gaps are big enough that picking the wrong one will cost you real money. So I ran 5 tests comparing Claude Fable 5 versus GPT 5.6 Soul, verified sources only, no vendor spin, no cherry picking. And the part that surprised me, Claude Fable 5 doesn't win a single test outright, but there's still one specific workflow where it's the smarter pick. You'll want to stick around to see if your use case lands in that bucket. Alright, so if you're a developer calling these models at scale, or a researcher who needs deep reasoning on long documents, this comparison is for you. At high volume, the pricing difference alone between Claude Fable 5 and GPT 5.6 Soul adds up fast, and getting it wrong is a pretty expensive mistake. Test 1 is reasoning speed and latency, and honestly, this one stings if you get it wrong. When a model takes 109 seconds just to return its first token, your whole pipeline stalls, your users bounce, and you're sitting there watching a spinner while the clock runs. What I found here was pretty stark. On artificial analysis, GPT 5.6 Soul with max reasoning finished tasks in 61% less time than Claude Fable 5, and that's not a rounding error. Claude Fable 5 also clocked a 109-second time to first token at max thinking, and I was expecting that to be painful in practice. It is. Now, take the raw token speed numbers with a grain of salt. GPT 5.6 Soul hits 750 tokens per second on Cerebrus hardware, while Claude Fable 5 maxes at 63.4 on standard infrastructure. And those aren't the same test setup, so you can't really stack them side by side. The task completion gap, though, is apples to apples. GPT 5.6 Soul takes this one. I was expecting the speed gap to be modest, but 61% faster on real task completion is not modest, so the scoreboard opens with GPT 5.6 Soul on the board first, Claude Fable 5 still at 0. Test 2 is API pricing, and this is where a lot of people get burned. You prototype with a model, everything works great, you scale it up, and then the bill shows up, and it's way bigger than you planned, which is just money left on the table. Okay, so I looked at the published API rates, and here's what we got. Claude Fable 5 runs $10 per $1 million input tokens and $50 per million output tokens, while GPT 5.6 Soul is $5 input and $30 output, so that's 50% cheaper on input and 40% cheaper on output, which is a pretty big deal at any real scale. GPT 5.6 Soul wins pricing, and it's not close. I was expecting the gap to be maybe 20%, but 50% cheaper on input is a real difference, and that's 2 wins now for GPT 5.6, Soul, 0 for Claude Fable 5, with 3 tests still to go. Test 3 is domain accuracy, and this one matters in a very concrete way. A model that scores 10 points lower on the agent's last exam benchmark means an agent that keeps breaking on you instead of shipping, and that's a real production problem. What surprised me here is how wide the gap is on agentic tasks. GPT 5.6 Soul scored 53.6 on agent's last exam versus around 40.5 for Claude Fable 5, so that's 13 points. And on the coding agent index, Soul hit 80 versus roughly 77.2. The one place Claude Fable 5 holds its own is the intelligence index v4.1, where it's essentially tied. Before I call this, I want to be honest about where Claude Fable 5 still competes. On general intelligence, the two models are within a point of each other, and Claude Fable 5's math scores, AIME 2025 at 90% and math at 91.2%, are genuinely strong, so if your work is research-heavy rather than agent-heavy, the accuracy gap is way smaller than the headline numbers suggest. GPT 5.6 Soul takes the accuracy test, mainly because of that 13-point lead on agentic tasks. I was expecting Claude Fable 5 to put up more of a fight on coding, but Soul edged it there too, so that's 3 wins for GPT 5.6 Soul now, and Claude Fable 5 is still sitting at 0. Test 4 is context window. If you've ever tried to drop a 50,000-word document into a model and watched it choke or truncate your input, you know exactly how painful a small context window is, because you lose data. The model hallucinates, and you end up chunking everything manually, which is a whole extra layer of work. So I looked at the published specs for both, and honestly, this one was a bit anticlimactic. Both Claude Fable 5 and GPT 5.6 Sol support 1 million token context windows, though one thing worth noting is that Claude Fable 5 charges no long context surcharge, while GPT 5.6 Sol's long context pricing isn't publicly documented yet. The number is the same, but the pricing transparency isn't. Claude Fable 5 is upfront about no extra charge for using that full million token window, while GPT 5.6 Sol hasn't published equivalent info, so if you're planning to regularly max out that context, right now only one of these models actually tells you what you'll pay. This one's a tie on the raw spec. Both models hit 1 million tokens, so neither pulls ahead on size, and I was honestly expecting at least one of them to have a bigger window. So the scoreboard stays at GPT 5.6, Sol 3, Claude Fable 5.0, with one tie on the board now. Test 5 is knowledge cutoff, and this one bites you in a very specific way. You ask the model about something that happened recently. It confidently gives you a wrong answer based on old data, and you don't catch it until it's already in your output. That's a trust problem, and it compounds fast. So I checked the official model cards for both. Claude Fable 5 has a knowledge cutoff of January 2026, and GPT 5.6 Sol is February 2026, so we're talking 1 month apart. And neither model has real-time internet access, which is something a lot of people don't realize going in. So if you need live data, you're going to need a separate search tool either way. Honestly, 1 month is not a meaningful gap for most workflows, unless you're specifically querying events from late January or early February 2026, you're not going to feel the difference between these two cutoffs. And the bigger issue for both models is the lack of real-time search, which is a tie in the worst possible way. Another tie. I was expecting GPT 5.6 Sol to have a bigger recency edge, but 1 month just doesn't move the needle in practice, so the final scoreboard lands at GPT 5.6, Sol wins 3, Claude Fable 5 wins 0, and 2 tests end in a draw. So where does Claude Fable 5 actually beat GPT 5.6 Sol? 3 places. General intelligence, where it edges ahead on the intelligence index V4.1. Deep math reasoning, with AME 2025 at 90% and math at 91.2%. And transparent long context pricing, meaning no surcharge for that full 1 million token window. Now, where does GPT 5.6 Sol clearly beat Claude Fable 5? Also 3 places, and these are bigger gaps. Real-world task speed at 61% faster, API pricing at half the cost on input tokens, and coding plus agentic tasks where Sol scored 13 points higher on agents last exam, and edged ahead on the coding agent index too. Okay, so I went into this thinking Claude Fable 5 would at least trade punches on a couple of tests, and it really didn't. GPT 5.6 Sol won 3, tied 2, and lost 0. But the rule is still use case based. If you need research-grade math reasoning or you want clear long context pricing, go with Claude Fable 5, and if you're running agents, writing code at scale, or just watching your API bill, GPT 5.6. Sol is the pick because half the price and 61% faster is pretty hard to argue with.